Hey, Wes here with Airstream Wanderings. Thanks for joining me here today. So we have a quiz, and the quiz is, what do these pots have in common with one another? I'll give you the answer. They were all made with native clays, different ones, but generally dug in Arizona. They were all made with the coil and scrape method. They were all fired on an outdoor fire. And that is the problem, because every single one of these is cracked. They're all broken in one way or another. Not in such a big way that they've fallen apart. In fact, what they have are little hairline cracks. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but they tend to crack on the bottom, and it kind of looks like varicose veins. And so as a result, they look too nice to throw away, but they're not nearly good enough to give away. And they all clunk, some of them pretty badly. They are clearly not usable. And I don't want my pots just to be purely decorative. So the question is, what do we do about that? And one of my favorite sayings is that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. Well, what are my results? They're cracked pots. Now, that's not true with all of my pots. Some of them work out. In fact, the majority of them do. But when you put a lot of time into a pot like this, you really would prefer that it worked out. And so that's what this video is all about, is trying to figure out what's going on with these cracks and do something differently than what I've done in the past, hopefully solve the problem. If you're interested in that, come along. Another one of my favorite sayings is that stupidity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, I'm getting pretty consistent results, and I need to change what I am doing. And right up front, I need to say I am an amateur. I frequently don't know what I'm doing. That's why I have problems. So you can follow the advice or ideas that I have here that may or may not work for you. It's interesting, this pottery in many ways is really, really simple, and in other ways it's extremely complex. There's a lot of physics going on and chemistry. I understand a little of it, but there's a lot of it I don't understand. And so there's a lot of trial and error, and I have the greatest respect and admiration for the native people and the current people who are able to do this on a consistent basis. So when I look at my cracks here, the question is, what's happening? And I'm not exactly sure. I have a better idea now. I'm not even sure when they are happening. Are they at the beginning of the fire or at the end? I know it's in the fire. Cracks and breakage that happens at the beginning of the fire usually have to do with moisture in the pot and spalling that you get. And that's not what's going on here. These are fine cracks. So what I did is I called someone who has decades of experience, sent him some pictures, and he immediately said, these are cooling cracks. He said, what's going on is the outside of the pot is cooling quicker than the inside of the pot. And actually, most of the pots that break like this are round pots like this. And you can imagine there's a lot of hot air that gets inside of this. When they're fired upside down. And when I've used my temperature gauge, my heat gun, the temperature down here is way cooler. I'm sorry, it was much, much hotter than the temperature up here towards the end of the fire. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of degrees difference from the bottom of the pot to the top of the pot. And I can imagine that the air that isn't circulating much on the inside is very, very hot. And so that's the problem. So what do you do about that? What can you do to equalize that kind of temperature differential that we're getting that's causing the cracks? So there's two things that we can do. Basically, it's a resilience issue. So one thing that you can do is change the grit, the temper, the grog that is in your clay. Clay by itself is expansive. It shrinks and expands with heat, with water. And so in almost all cases with natural clay, you need to add something to it that's more stable, that is not expansive. I'll get into these things a little bit later. So if we can put more grog or a specific kind of grog or temper in it, we can stabilize it some. Stabilize it not only during the drying phase, so we don't get drying cracks, but also during firing. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit longer or later in more detail. But that's one thing. The way that I am tempering it, I think, is a problem. The other thing is the way that the pots are protected. They're cooling too quickly, and so how could I slow down that cooling process? And I think that has a lot to do with cover sherds and the way the pots are actually protected. And so I'm going to get into that in the second part. So let's go ahead and talk about temper a little bit and what I've been doing and what I'm going to try and do in the future. So the goal of temper is to even things out. It will help even out the drying process, so you're less likely to get drying cracks, which is not my problem, but it also will help with the thermal shock. And if you think about it, you build a fire that you have your pottery in, and it can ramp up to a temperature of 14 or 1500 degrees in less than 10 minutes. So it doesn't take very long, and that's a massive amount of shock. And so it does make sense that you're going to use temper. And I thought, well, as long as it's non-expensive material, it doesn't make any difference. So what I was doing is grinding up sherds, and I ground up fine temper like this. I thought that would be fine. I thought, in fact, that it would make it easier to work the clay. Here's the problem. When the person I talked to said, what you really want is temper that is larger, maybe the size of a head of a pin, and angular, because what you really are looking for is something for the clay to grab onto. And it really can't grab onto this. The analogy he made was you put flour down on a countertop when you roll out pizza, and that actually acts as a lubricant. And that's what's going on with the clay. There's nothing really to grab onto. So instead, you make a temper that is bigger. I don't know if you can see this very well. Again, about the size of the head of a pin. And what I did was then I just took sherds like this, put it in my grinder, and you can adjust the size. But then it comes out actually all kinds of sizes. And so what you have to do then is sift it out so you get the size you want. You don't get too big or too small. But it still comes out with a lot of dust in it. So then the next thing to do is to take your ground up sherds and you rinse them off. You rinse away all the dust, all those fine particles that may be non-expensive, but they aren't something that the clay can grab onto. Another option is to buy grog, which is just ground up sherds. And you can get this, as I understand it, in a pottery store. Someone gave this to me. So that would be another option. And this comes in a variety of different sizes. So my goal here is to use larger size temper and to have it washed so it is very consistent. And hopefully then that will help manage the thermal shock that I have. Another possibility for temper is sand. And so this is just a bag of play sand that I got at Home Depot, I think. It's very irregular. So what I've done is I've sifted it. And first I sifted out the really big chunks. That's just way too big. Then I sifted out the small stuff. And actually it was the small stuff that I was using before. Again, too small. So now what I have is medium kind of sand. I did not wash it. Maybe I should. But because of the fine sifting, hopefully I've gotten rid of the small stuff. But again, I'm shooting for something that's the head of a pin. Now, a couple possible problems with sand. One is just the way sand is made. It's tumbled and rolled through glaciers and so on. And so it may not have real jagged edges that the clay can bite into. So that is a possible problem. And you can look at your sand to see, but all of it is kind of rounded. But it was a fairly common temper material for Native Americans. Another possibility is that it can have calcium in it that can spall when you fire your pots. So one way to test that is to get some vinegar, pour vinegar over the top and look to see if it bubbles and is reactive to the acid in the vinegar. And I've done that with this, and I've not been able to see that there's any bubbling. So I think I'm okay with that, and I'm hoping that this size sand is going to do the trick for me. Okay, so the second piece is about controlling the actual heat that is happening in the fire. And like I indicated before, the inside and bottom of the pot are considerably hotter than the outside. So what are some of the things you might do with that? Well, one is to fire on a calm day so you don't have wind blowing across it, or a cooler day could potentially cause problems. So that is something you want to consider, using a calm day if you can. The other possibility is to actually protect the pot itself. And so you can use pottery sherds. Here's an example. And basically you set the pot up and cover it with sherds. It does a couple of things. One, the main reason I've used sherds in the past is to manage fire clouds. And so I protect the pot from the smoke and the fire and being in touch with other organic material that will cause like all this black stuff going on. But the other thing is it can create a shield from the heat and kind of maintain the heat. Well, I should have known this because quite frankly, one of the things I like to make are effigy pots. And I've made quite a few of them. 100% of those have been successful. I've never had one break. And I think about it, well, what makes that different? I typically, before I fire them, I cover them pretty generously in sherds, mostly so they don't get fire clouds. I have some here, but I make sure it's on the bottom and not on the top because the image of this is pretty important. So I think that is another thing that I need to do is be more careful about covering pots with cover sherds. A number of the pots where I've had issues have been bigger ones, which are more difficult to cover. That tells me that I need to make some more sherds and to cover them. So that is another possibility of things that I need to do. Well, I have some ideas of what to do. I don't know that it is going to solve my problem for sure or not. I just need to do some experimentation. And I need to manage that because if I make a lot of changes all at one time, I won't know what change actually made the difference. So one of the first things I'm going to do, I made a pot, and this has 30% coarse ground sherds in it. And I found that 30% makes this clay pretty hard to work with. And so that's maybe more than I need. But I will fire this without any sherd covering and just see if it will survive all on its own. Hopefully that will make a difference. I also have some pots that I previously made with the small temper, and I will fire those, but I will generously cover those in sherds like this. Now, one thing I need to keep in mind is you need enough air circulation around these sherds. So you want to protect the pot, but if you protect it too much, I think you may not get a good firing. Here is the finished fired pot. I went out into the woods with my friend here a couple days ago, built a campfire and fired this thing. And we did it without any sherds or anything over the top. No protection. This clay is tempered with 30% very coarse temper, so it should not break even without sherd protection. But guess what? It did. But I'm not sure that we have a clear answer here because, and you probably can't see it, there's a crack here, a crack there, a crack there, a crack there. So there were 4 cracks all radiating out from the center. I think these are stress cracks or fractures rather than cooling cracks because they just look different. And one of the things that I did when I made this pot, it had a round bottom, and when it was kind of leather hard, I pushed it down and wiggled it around on the table to give it a kind of a flat bottom so it wouldn't roll around. I think I maybe created some cracks at that time that I just could not see. And these things, there's only one of these 4 cracks that even shows through. They're hard to see. So I would have to say that this experiment so far is inconclusive. I don't know whether those are stress fractures of some sort or cooling cracks. But I do have another little pot, exactly the same clay. This is not fired yet. And so I need to build a fire and see if that will make a difference. So the journey continues. It's always going to be interesting. That's all part of the fun. Well, in a future video, I will fire this pot. It has just coarse temper in it, no protection. See if that will solve the problem. I will also fire this pot, which was made a while ago actually, and it has small temper in it. But what I will be doing is covering it heavily with sherds and see if that takes care of my cracking problem. So if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing, and until next time, this is Wes with Airstream Wanderings, wishing you health, happiness, peace, and love. Take care. Bye-bye. 1770. That's a hot fire.